I recently saw, as a matter of fact, just yesterday, saw the Chinese version, or parts of the Chinese version, of Death of a Salesman. And it was fascinating to see.
Which is a heartening thing to me, only for the reason that the cultural differences are there. But way down deep below there, it's one humanity.
Yeah.
And that's a reassuring thing.
When he first came to China and met the actors, said, "Don't try to imitate Americans. You will be most American when you are most Chinese." The actors were really baffled. And then we realized that we had to delve into the inner worlds of these characters, their dreams, their illusions, and their values. That's how the Loman family became truly Chinese, and therefore truly American.
I've known Arthur Miller, man and boy, for almost half a century, since the time that the two of us attended the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, back in the middle 30s and later. And I know a little about him, but I want to know a good deal more. Arthur, your early years, you were born and brought up to begin with on the Upper East Side of Manhattan?
On 112th Street between Lenox and Fifth Avenue.
Middle class, Jewish,
Right.
well-to-do?
Yeah, in that period. The crash knocked my father for a loop. But before that, things were pretty good.
Observant Jewish family?
Yeah, they were, but they weren't. Like most of those people, they were trying to assimilate into the United States. So it was a case of getting more religious as you neared death, or as you went to school in your early years, but in the productive years, they weren't too worried about it.
When you say they weren't too worried about it, was your family, did they want to turn their backs in any sense?
Not really, no. It was just that there was no time for it. They were busy making a life in the country. I think they felt more and more secure, probably, and didn't need the support of a very Jewish community.
And then in 1928-29, that's when your dad had financial reverses?
Up to then, had a very big company, and he'd invested a lot of money on the stock market, like a lot of clever people then and now.
Mm-hmm.
And they made the world-shaking discovery that they could make more money on the stock market than they could make in their businesses. So more and more capital, not only him, but some pretty smart people, educated people, did the same thing. When it collapsed, it carried away the working capital of hundreds of perfectly good businesses, among which was his.
So you moved from?
We went from Manhattan to Brooklyn, which was a move into the wilderness.
How so?
Well, my mother loved Manhattan. My father did. They saw all the shows and the excitement of living in Manhattan. And suddenly, they're out in the middle of Midwood. You might as well have been in Minnesota, from their viewpoint.
Really?
Sure, it was far away, at the end of a subway line.
How old were you at the time?
12, 13.
So it didn't really make that much difference to you, the move from Manhattan
I liked it.
to Brooklyn?
I couldn't have been happier.
Because?
Because I loved the outdoors, and in those days, Brooklyn was wide open. I had cousins out there who were Boy Scouts. We went around under the trees and the bushes and made knots and hunted stuff, and it was great fun.
Good student, you?
I wasn't, no. I was passed over by education. I learned nothing, really, till possibly the last year in high school, I began to realize that those books were supposed to be telling me something.
You mean up to that time you were just a boy's boy, in a sense?
I was playing football. I was busy going to Coney Island fishing. I was doing absolutely anything you could do except study. Now, I did read spasmodically. My mother was a great reader, and she always had somebody from Columbia University come tutor her on the latest literature.
Really?
She'd pay some graduate student to come and sit, talk with her about books.
But that didn't rub off on you to begin with.
Well, I learned to respect the whole thing, but I didn't have time for it. I was too busy in the street and playing games and kidding around. And suddenly it hit me at about the age, I suppose, of about 16. I picked up some, what I thought were crime books. One was called Crime and Punishment. And I read that. And I was in a daze for about a month. It took me 2 months to read it.
Really?
I hadn't realized that words were like that it can convey that kind of tidal drag on your spirit. I was living in the book. So then I started looking at, I started with Dostoevsky. Totally unawares. I was not assigned the book. As I say, I loved mystery stories. So I thought that was one of them.
You applied to go to the University of Michigan once.
I was turned down.
And was turned down.
Yeah,
Because
my
of
grades were so dreadful.
Really?
Sure. The only thing I learned in high school was French. I had a great French teacher. She had large breasts and was a wonderful, motherly woman. She loved me. The rest of them couldn't care less, as far as I knew. And she, somehow or another, I thought she was terrific, and I connected with her.
Intellectually.
I wouldn't call it intellectually. It was almost sensuous. The language suddenly opened up. I learned English through French as well.
How do you mean?
Well, I learned that there were parts of speech that they'd been teaching me all these years meant nothing to me. Through French, I learned a little bit about the structure of English. That it had a structure, that it wasn't something that grew between the cracks in the sidewalk. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I did some reading in high school, but not a hell of a lot.
Any writing?
I started thinking of the idea of writing as a result of radio. I could always tell jokes. I loved jokes. And the radio at those days with Jack Benny, Fred Allen, Joe Penna. It was full of comics.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps a dozen of them that we don't even remember anymore, but I vaguely remember their voices. And I have a very oral imagination. What I hear means probably more to me than what I see. So I could imitate all of them. And the idea of dialogue came about as a result of all this oral stimulation. I was listening to these great comics.
But this was still in high school?
Still in high school. I was 14, 15 years old. So there was a radio news commentator. He had a British accent.
Boke Carter.
Boke Carter. And he was a hysteric who was kept in place by his English accent. And he would report, Gabriel Heater was in that school. You know, if somebody fell down on the street in front of Macy's, they'd stop press with this and exaggerate the whole story ludicrously. And so Major Beau's Amateur Hour was on in those days. And by now, we were living on nothing a week. And the idea of making a little money with writing some stuff for Major Beau's Amateur Hour and maybe selling it somehow struck me. And on one of the typewriters from one of my father's bankrupt businesses, which were lying around the house, I wrote this takeoff on Boat Carter. And I went down to Major Beau's amateur hour, and I read it. There was a mob of tap dancers, bird callers, piano players, opera singers, but of course they were all professionals, out of work professionals, and I was practically the only amateur in the building. And I read my piece, and to my amazement, that whole crowd started laughing. And when it was over, out of the sound booth came this little man with a curvature of the spine, who had a severe limp, smoking a cigar.
The major?
No, it was a major. He was a minor. He was really about 4'3", and he came up to me and he said, "Who wrote that?" I said, "I did." He said, "Can I see it?" Well, my God, of course. I gave it to him. He handed me a card. It came from one of the advertising agents, Lord and Thomas, Philadelphia. He says, "You'll hear from us." Well, I flew home on the subway. And I waited. Nothing happened. Week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. There was a comedian named Phil Baker who also played the accordion.
Yes.
In fact, in his desperation, the poor man played the accordion in the lobby of the Paramount Theater sometimes to amuse the line of waiting customers. I turn on that, and there's my piece. Not done as well as I could do it.
By Phil Baker?
By Phil Baker. Well, in other words, the first thing I'd ever written was stolen. And I never got a nickel. I wrote them a letter.
And?
No answer. Nothing. And that was, I suppose that taught me to be a good member of the Dramatist Guild or something. Anyway, nothing happened after that. But I saw that I could write stuff that could be spoken.
And that was your first sally into this kind of thing?
The first time I'd written anything.
Again, 14, 15 at this
I was
time?
about 15 then, I think.
All right. Now, but you eventually did go to the University of Michigan, so how you had been turned down, you say?
What happened was this. They were right. I couldn't argue with it. They were perfectly correct. I should not be allowed.
Your grades were that bad?
Oh, it was terrible. But I had changed in the interval. It came over me suddenly. I suddenly had a severe change in my personality, literally. I could almost feel it happening. I grew up in like 3 months after I graduated from high school. And I was then driving a truck in Long Island City. And life suddenly became serious. So I thought, if I could find some way of convincing them that I was capable of doing some work, which I now felt I probably was, that would be great. So I wrote them another letter. I said, "You're perfectly right, I shouldn't have been let in, but I'm changing. I've changed now. And maybe you could reconsider this application." So they wrote me back and said, "If you can produce a bank book showing that you have $500 in the bank so that you do not become a ward of the state of Michigan."
Well, I remember the tuition for out-of-state people like you and me, I came from Massachusetts, was double what it was.
That's right.
Inside
it was all of $85.
That's right.
But they weren't interested in the $85 as much as that I would have living expenses, that I would not be a ward of theirs. So I wrote back and said, "I'll get the $500, and I worked 3 years and saved up $500.
You worked 3 years before you were able to...
Well, I made $15 a week. Figure it out. I finally made the $500 and went there.
And you went to Ann Arbor. Now, you wanted to be a journalist at that time?
Well, that was the excuse. I didn't really want to be in the journal. I had to tell my father something, because he'd said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And
Sure.
you couldn't say you're going to be a writer. Who pays a writer? So journalists, he figured, are on somebody's payroll when they're lucky. So I invented that. But, and I thought possibly if I had to, I would try to get a job as a journalist, although that was difficult too at that time.
But in the back of your mind, really, at that time was...
I wanted to write.
Right.
I didn't know what.
Oh. Not prose, not plays. You did
No,
poetry.
I just was lusting to put something down on a piece of paper.
And so you went and you did.
Well, I started writing stories, and since I had more experience than most freshmen did, I was out of school for really 2 years, 2.5 years longer than most of them.
Right.
They were younger than I. And I'd been knocking around in New York on the streets for some time, you know, with various jobs. I worked in a warehouse for a while, and I worked in various places. I had more to say, and that intrigued the professors, who also had no experience in life except in going to school. So I was news from outside.
You were what, 18, 19, 20?
By that time I was 19, yeah.
And what kind of thing did you write?
I wrote stories about what I'd lived through, really.
Short stories?
Short stories, you
Not
know.
plays?
No, but the first play occurred because, well, first of all, I discovered the theater in Ann Arbor. Amazingly enough, there was very little theater, but what there was made me feel that I could connect with it somehow.
You mean you'd not been to a play before?
I had seen about 3-4 plays in my life.
In Broadway?
Well, not on Broadway, but in the 20s, when I was growing up there, on 7th Avenue, between 110th and 125th, there must have been 2 or 3 legitimate theaters that were like road company theaters. The Schuberts owned them.
Mm-hmm.
They were small houses where they played melodramas and little things that were not on Broadway. That had been on Broadway probably 10 years earlier. My mother, in the afternoon, the place was full of women at a matinee. I saw 2 desperate melodramas there that I thought were just wonderful.
When you were in your young teens?
Yeah, well, then I was only 9 or 10 years of age. But they remained vividly in my mind. I thought they were just marvelous. So by the time I was at Michigan, I had only seen really about 3 or 4 plays at most when the Hopwood Awards were on then, as they are there now. They were giving away the munificent sum of $250 to a freshman.
I remember the excitement about you and the fact that you did get. You won a couple of Avery Hopwood Awards, I think, for playwriting.
Yeah. So I decided on the second spring vacation of my sophomore year that I would try to write a play. And we had 5-day vacations, if you remember. The 5 days plus a weekend, so it was 7 days. And so instead of going home, I stayed there and I wrote this play, but never going to sleep. And across the hall lived Jim Dahl, who was the costumer for the theater.
Right.
He was older than I was and a very sweet fellow, and he's dead now, but he had half his teeth were missing. It was very common in the Depression. People didn't have money to go to dentists.
Was Valentine Wint?
Valentine was his good friend.
Was he at that time the head of the
He was the head of
play production?
Play production. And he lived across, I lived in his parents' house, the Dahl house. And the father was 6'6", the mother was 6'6", and Jim was 6'6". And he had a brother who was 6'6". They were all giants in this tiny little house. Anyway, I wrote day and night, and I went across the hall and I said, "How long is an act?" And he said, "Well, it's about 30 minutes. Those were 3-act plays, you know." So I had my alarm clock, and I had written half this play by this time. And I turned on the alarm clock and I read it. Saying, and just as the curtain was falling down, it went off.
Success.
And so I felt, gee, that was interesting. So I got the sense of timing from that. And I finished the play and nearly collapsed from want of sleep and brought it in, and that won a lot of prizes. But,
Honors at Dawn, was that the one?
no, that was called the
No Villain?
No Villain, yes.
No Villain.
That was the original title. Interesting. See, that was a play about a strike, which obtrudes into a family. The father's the boss. And there are two sons, naturally. I had a brother. And the sons are split with the father as on the issues of the strike. But this was the height of the class consciousness of the 30s. This is when Clifford Odets was really moving. Mm-hmm. This would be already 1934. 5. But see, I was calling it No Villain because I couldn't decide who was right. And anyway, it had some good characters in it. It was very autobiographical, probably the most autobiographical thing I ever wrote.
No Villain was.
Yeah.
Let me understand something, Arthur. You're now in your late teens, 18, 19, verging on 20. So what had gone before was this middle class, I suppose upwardly mobile Jewish family, Manhattan, suddenly brought low economically,
That's
financially.
Right. Yeah.
Brooklyn, had to shift for yourself, had in the back of your mind that you would like to write, you weren't sure quite what, and you were going to write out of your gut or out of your understanding, and your understandings were troubles.
Well, there was plenty of trouble. On our block in Brooklyn, I remember somebody saying that in the period of that year there were 3 suicides. These perfectly ordinary people.
People who committed suicide because of financial reverse?
Financial reverses. They couldn't figure out how to live without money.
Yeah.
And I suppose that was not all that unique. Later on, I did some research when I was writing a play later, The American Clock, and I looked up, I just happened to open the New York Times of 30. And there was a report in there, an interview with a psychologist at one of the universities in New York who said that in his opinion, something like 100,000 New Yorkers would never be in a psychological condition to work again because of this shock. And that's a lot of people in those days. New York had 3.5 million people.
So that's what out of those experiences, your writing grew.
The writing grew. One of the matrices for me was the vision of a structure which was extremely delicate, that could collapse at any time, regardless of how strong and secure it seemed. Therefore, there had to be values somewhere that were not references to the big structure. They had to be inside here someplace if you were going to survive. Mm-hmm. Because just objectively, for the longest period, during the 30s, it's forgotten now, but, by 37, let's say, people conventionally were saying, I guess this is the way it's going to be. That the country simply sunk in this slow motion, in this dream. There'd be a spurt of business activity for 3 months. Everybody said, well, now we're starting again. And it would slide back again. And
it's hard to imagine now in 1986.
It's impossible to imagine.
Yeah.
It's impossible. Now, for some people in America right now, what I'm saying is probably not all that outlandish. There are towns in the country that simply are sunk in this seemingly permanent sleep.
Pockets of poverty, I guess is what they say, or people that time passed by. What about your own family? What about your father? Did he ever do well again?
No, he survived it. He just managed to sort of pump along on a very low level, but he never returned to his former glories.
And was that a blight on his life and on your mother's?
Yeah, I think so. But he was very stoic. He was stoic. He never made complaints about anything. It's just that the time comes where, I guess actors know that very well, that they're not going to make it.
That's such an ephemeral job, acting. I mean, you're no better in a sense, I suppose. You're no more secure than last week's play or next week's...
And a man in business is no better off than last week's balance. And keeps hanging there. He can't get it up. He can't make it happen anymore. And after a few years, they know that it's probably never going to happen. So there was that. I wouldn't call it a despair, just a recognition that the great days are in the past.
We won't move that fast into these next two plays, but surely there is a seed of All My Sons and a seed of Death of a Salesman.
Oh, sure.
In what happened then. At Ann Arbor, you married Mary Slattery?
Right.
In the middle of college?
No. We didn't marry. We met there. But we didn't marry until 2 years after we graduated. Till 40.
Back to Brooklyn?
I came back. Well, I lived in Manhattan for a while. I had a room. I got on for about 6 months to the Writers Project of the WPA. It was just folding up, but I managed to hitch on while before it collapsed.
What'd you make a month out of that?
$22.77 a week.
$22.77 a week.
Well, Orson Welles made about 35, I think. We paid it back. I used to say the people that on the theater projects paid back their pay 1,000 times over in their income tax.
Yes.
But that was the salary for my grade, which was pretty low.
And you stayed there for how long?
Well, it all folded up after about 5 or 6 months. But in that period, it was terrific because just out of school, I had no job. It was unlikely I could get a job writing. There was a lot of newspapermen out of work.
You had a job at the Navy Yard, didn't you, in Brooklyn?
That was later. So getting on the project, on the WPA thing, was terrific because it gave you time. I wrote a big tragedy about Montezuma and Cortez, and I could survive for a while. And then at the same time, I started writing for the Columbia workshop.
Norman Corwin?
And I did a couple of plays for him.
Well, wait a minute. That's fairly big time. Columbia Broadcasting System Workshop. I don't know how much it paid, but there was a great amount of prestige attaching to that.
There were no advertisers, you remember. So they paid $100. But that didn't matter. The great thing was they had wonderful actors and great productions.
So
and Norman was a genius with the microphone.
Norman Corwin.
Sure.
So now you're beginning to feel yourself
a
playwright of sorts?
I began to feel that I could somehow make this happen.
This is what, in 1940?
No, that's still late 39, early 40. Yeah. Then I started to get, as a result of that, I got some assignments from people like the Cavalcade of America.
DuPont.
And that was a real wonderful racket because they gave you all the research. And you were supposed to write, well, it was 28 minutes about George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, some great constitutional conflict, slavery, whatever. And I got so good at it that I was the utility man. See, then I got higher pay than most of them because...
How much did you get?
Well, they paid $250 normally, but I was finally getting about $500 or $600 for each script, which was a lot of money.
No income tax?
Nothing.
Big money.
That was, and I mean, a pack of tobacco cost 8 cents.
Yeah.
You buy a pair of shoes for $6. That was a lot of money.
Did you have any children then? Did children born
The
yet?
first child was 41, yes. But I could get on. I need only write 6 or 8 of those a year, and I could get so I could write them in one day. See, they'd get stuck. They'd have a play. Those were very elaborate productions. They had a 40-piece orchestra, you know, to play the little pieces of 8 notes in between scenes. Mm-hmm. They had orchestrations that thick you would think they were going to play the Ninth Symphony. And they had terrific casts. They hired the best stars and was very beautifully mounted, the stuff. And I saved Homer Fickett's head.
Homer Fickett.
By accident. You remember him? He was this tremendously fat, cheerful, wonderful fellow who was the director and sort of the producer of the Cavalcade of America. And one week, I had done about 7 or 8 of those things, and he would save me for when he really had an emergency. That is, they started rehearsing on whatever it was, Tuesday, let's say, and they'd rehearse about 3 days, you know. It was like doing a major production.
Mm-hmm.
By Friday, he'd know that he had no show, that the whole thing was simply hopeless, or Thursday. And he'd call me up. They had a house historian who had a file full of historical material, you see, with the easy-to-read books for these moronic radio writers like me. And he'd say, Arthur, I got to get something quick. So I'd say, well, ship it over. And he'd send a messenger down to Brooklyn Heights, and he'd have some book, and I'd read the book.
Brooklyn Heights, not just plain Brooklyn.
No, but this was already on Montague Street.
Yes.
And
Upper class.
oh, yeah. Well, that was a beautiful place then.
Still
It
is.
still is. And I'd read the thing, and then next evening I'd have it for him. I'd written the thing. And they didn't have to change much. See, I knew exactly where. It was a geometrical problem.
Okay, but a fella can get trapped by being that
I never
good.
had any illusions about it. I mean, to me, it was absolutely
Just
like
money?
hauling coal.
Okay.
I mean, I was just carrying coal.
And for the rest of the time?
I was writing plays.
None of them produced on Broadway yet.
No.
But you were writing plays. Well, I guess what I'm driving at is you're hauling coal to pay the bills.
That's right.
Mary Slattery, your wife, was working.
She was a secretary, yes. She was working. We were doing all right.
But the serious time was in writing plays.
I could write on my plays for 2 weeks, really uninterrupted. Mm-hmm. And then for 2 days or 3 days, I would be involved with Homer, with the DuPont company.
And you're now in your middle 20s.
Well, it's still early 20s, I guess. Well, I guess I was about 25 by this time. But I was also writing a story or two, but my heart wasn't in that. It was really in the theater. By now, I was watching the theater.
You knew.
Yeah, I wanted to be a playwright. And I had always wanted to be a playwright in school, too, because I'd won these prizes with various plays at Michigan, and I took myself seriously as a playwright, not as a...
And finally, Broadway took The Man Who Had All the Luck.
That was initially I thought I'd write a novel, which I worked a year on, and it just never got off the ground. And then I decided it would be a play, and I wrote a play. And it was finally done by Joe Fields, who was the brother of Dorothy Fields, who was a book writer for musicals. Mm-hmm. And Joe had written musicals. And he was a son of Weber and Fields, great comedian.
The theme of The Man Who Had All the Luck?
Well, that was, to put it in a nutshell, I suppose it's difficult, but it was about a man who couldn't do anything wrong. Simple man in the Middle West. And the more he won in terms of social standing and money, and his business, he was an orphan boy who ends up, I should say in the original version he was an orphan boy. I gave him a father and a brother by the end of this thing. I was getting ready to write All My Sons and Death of a Salesman. But I was just feeling my way in the dark. He finds himself one of the biggest businessmen in this tiny town, and he doesn't know why. The whole thing is menacing him. He can't figure out
Why he's so lucky.
why he's got it, and everybody around him has one or another misfortune. One man is desperate to have children, he can't. Another man was badly crippled in the First World War. Another one is this, and another one is that, and he's got nothing to be sorry about. And he's on the verge of suicide to ward off the blow, which he sure as hell is going to hit him. He's got all his money in a mink farm now. There is nothing more dangerous than putting your money in mink. And mink eat their young in times of great storm, and especially hailstorms can be fatal to the whole shooting match. And of course, when they're bearing, there's a hailstorm. His relationship to this catastrophe is what this play is about.
Let me tell you what George Jean Nathan,
Good God, did he review it? I can't even remember.
the man who had All the Lock opened on November 23rd, 1944, and closed after 4 performances. The author's theme was the venerable one relating to whether man's fate is preordained or whether it rests in his own hands, began George Jean Nathan's acerbic review. The play, a long-winded, earnest drama about a tormented garage mechanic, was so confused that it left the Journal American's critic, quote, confidently expecting the final curtain to come down upon the spectacle of everyone on stage squirting seltzer siphons at one another, while the main character declared it had all been a burlesque.
You know that critic, incidentally, who's quoted there by whoever wrote that,
James Atlas.
called me about a month after the play closed. In fact, I think his name was John Anderson. Just comes to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd never gotten a phone call from a critic. I'd never met a critic. He said, I'd like to talk to you. I went and met him at the New York Athletic Club, where I'd never entered either. And he said, you know, I've been thinking about that play. And I said, really? Yeah. He said, you know, that's really a tragedy, but you were writing it as a folk comedy. You should write tragedies.
Really?
He said, you know, that's very hard to do, to create that image of a whole cosmos about to fall on a man. Of course, I never thought of it in those terms, but I had never thought of it as a folk comedy either.
First Broadway show, 4 performances, out. Bad notices. What does that do to the psyche? Honest.
I swore I'd never write another play. In fact, I then proceeded to write a novel. I figured I'd give that up. There's no way for me to handle the theater.
I must tell you in passing that those of us who were your friends, you didn't know about this, felt badly about that. And when Focus, the novel, came out, we were rooting, and of course it was. I'd sold something like 90,000 copies,
it was
which was a huge number of copies, and everybody was, who knew you back in Ann Arbor, was so pleased.
Well, I was resolved that I would never go through that again. I tell you, it wasn't the notices that put me off. Every playwright goes through this. It was that I couldn't recognize my play on the stage. I didn't know enough to know that the whole attack on it was comedic, or semi-comedic, or folkic. That wasn't what I was interested in. I was really interested in what Nathan was talking about, but it would be a little bit like taking King Lear and treating it perhaps as a family drama. See?
Which indeed I suppose it could be.
And part of it is, of course, but that's not a way to play King Lear.
King Lear as Dallas.
King Lear's Dallas, yes.
Well, it was just 3 years later, according to this account in the New York Times. Mr. Miller refuted F. Scott Fitzgerald's axiom that there are no second acts in American life with All My Sons.
Yeah, well, that came partly out of this trial by fire, because I was now 30, I think, or 31, about there. I knew a lot of playwrights who had failed. They were a lot of my friends. And I resolved I was never going to hang around writing play after play that nobody did. It was pointless. Life was too interesting. So I wrote that novel, which indeed was successful. And I thought, well, I'll take one more shot at it because I had a wonderful idea. But that I would not release it out of my hands until I was convinced, as I had not been with all Man with All Luck, that every minute of it was going to work, that I could see it work, that I wasn't going to rely on somebody else to make it work. So I spent better than 2 years on that script.
Who bought it? Who produced it?
I gave the script to Leland Haywood, who was then the head of an agency. Never heard from him. So I was so sure of that play by this time that I went down there, I'll never forget it, to that great office, and he was a flashy guy. And I said, I want my script back and all my other scripts. I'm leaving this office. Well, they went into a faint. He said, you can't be serious. I said, I'm serious. I've got to get on with this thing. They said, give us 24 hours. So I did, and a lady named Kay Brown, who was then a young woman, called me up and said, let me try to do something with this. I think we've got a show here. So she gave it to the Theater Guild and to a fellow named Kazan, who was in partnership with a guy named Klarman, who, of course, were my gods in the 30s.
Harold Clurman, Ilya Kazan, and Walter Freed.
That's right. And, of course, Kazan and Klarman, Kazan was a great actor, had become a very interesting director, although he was still at the early phases of his career. And Klarman, of course, was, as far as I was concerned, was God Almighty. He was the brain of the group theater. He wrote, when I did see some of his essays about the theater, they were brilliant. They, both the Guild and them, wanted it. So I had a choice suddenly of two of the best productions in New York, and I chose them because I simply felt related to them. And then the question was which of them should direct it? And the actor scuttlebutt on the street was that Kazan was really more vital as a director. So I said, let him direct it. And Harold was very terrific about it. He just kept walking around rubbing his hands saying, I want a hit!
And he got a hit.
And they were marvelous. Those were the days when they were still hungry. And the theater was a serious business, and there was a vitality there that was marvelous. But they were both youngish men. And
you know who played the lead? Well, the lead. Ed Begley played in it. And Arthur Kennedy. And Carl Malden.
that's right.
Names that we've
These
dealt
are all
with.
young actors.
Yes, of course. As a matter of fact, going through the casts of various of your shows from the 40s and the 50s, yeah, I was stunned by the kind of people who just early in their careers
That's right.
wound up in Miller plays. Well, All My Sons was a huge, it was a success of esteem as well as a commercial hit, no?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that ran a long time. That was made a hit, really, by Brooks Atkinson. Without him, I'm not sure what would have happened. We had very good audiences from the outset, but they were a bit chary of the play because it was pretty fierce. And then as now, Broadway was not interested in tough stuff. But he did 2 Sunday pieces about the play. And
In the
about me.
Times.
Yeah. And that put it over. Those 2 pieces. And I won the Critics' Award as a result of that, really.
Mm-hmm.
And that established the play.
And then just 2 years later, Death of a Salesman.
Yeah, well, of course, by that time, I felt I owned the theater, see, because I had a great director. I knew that there were marvelous people all over the place to play these things. That's another important thing. I owe a lot to actors. I'm not being sentimental now. It was a practical matter.
Well, listen, Lee J. Cobb, Mildred Dunnick, Arthur Kennedy, Alan Hewitt, Tom Petty,
They were great
Constance
people.
Ford, they were extraordinary.
They were wonderful people. Well, that was Kazan's casting.
Yeah. That's almost 40 years ago.
Yeah. And he hardly missed with any of them. Every one of them were extremely talented people and vivid people on stage.
The difference between the theater then in the 40s and now in the 80s, the Broadway theater, the New York theater.
I'm glad we're talking now because I just happen to feel, as a result maybe of insufficient evidence, that we're coming out of the trough again. I could be wrong.
Well, the trough, you mean?
Well, you see, there's something happened. It's very difficult to put a finger on it, but my own personal feeling is that somewhere around the middle 50s, the audience became atomized, meaning that the intellectual part of the audience, by intellectual I don't mean heavy thinkers, I just mean school teachers, the informed part of the audience that were passionate theater goers, separated out from the part of the theater which is rather inert. They are simply there passively to be entertained. They have no curiosity about the theater. They want to tap their foot to a tune. They can easily be sold by critics on something, as opposed to that other group, which has its own critical attitudes, cares very much about it.
What happened to that other group?
It's hard to know.
Could they not afford to go to the theater
Well,
anymore because the prices began to rise?
Prices began to go up. This was my theory then, and I'm sure it has a lot to do with it. But a similar thing happened in Europe, where the prices were not the issue. And that's why I say there's a certain cloud over the whole phenomenon. It's not quite as simple as the prices, but in our case it was, no doubt about it. Price had a lot to do with it. For instance, I talked to people in those days who came over to see American theater from places like Poland, Yugoslavia, Germany, West Germany, East Germany, where they had subsidized theaters. And they were telling me that there was a slackening off of interest in the theater in their countries. God knows, it could have been the impact of the early television. It could have been a number of other things, but there certainly was a breakdown in the community. See, everybody asks, where are the playwrights? Well, I ask, where's the audience? The playwright is in a very, very delicate relationship with his audience. If they are not prepared to give as much as they take, you haven't got a theater. You've got show business, but it's not a theater. And they have to care a lot, and they've got to be in a position to know something about what they're looking at. It's a bit like music. If I throw the finest pianists into a Carnegie Hall where nobody knows anything about Mozart, and all they know is perhaps Cole Porter, which is perfectly good, they may sit there and say, well, where is Cole Porter?
What are you saying? That they went away from you, or they went away from people who liked you and went to something that was simply more popular?
They didn't go anywhere. See, that's the thing. They vanished into the woodwork. Now, a certain number of them went off-Broadway. See, the off-Broadway theater began roughly at that time. But it wouldn't have begun if there had not been that break. I'll give you an example. The Crucible opened sometime, I guess, in 53 or thereabouts, and fundamentally failed. That we went on for some months, but we were really struggling. In 2 years, it opened off-Broadway at the Martinique Theater in a much worse production, I must say. It was a semi-amateur production as comparison to the one we had originally. Ran for almost 2 years.
Now, were the prices a lot lower?
Oh, they were a fraction of the Broadway price.
And by that time they had had an opportunity to think about...
Also, McCarthy had died.
Right. McCarthy had died.
Yeah. He was dead by this time.
Right.
So it was all right to see the play. But I think in addition, there was something else. The youth had taken to the off-Broadway theater, and they had left the Broadway theater. And now you went, at least I did, I went into a Broadway theater, not to my shows, but to Tennessee shows or anybody else's, or Inge. Looked around, and everybody was bald. They were bald or decrepit. And I used to connect the theater with the youth. That's what I always thought. That's what I thought I was addressing. Well, they weren't there anymore. And that was the divide, somewhere in the mid-50s. And I think Tennessee would have said the same thing. He was now talking to a different group of people. They didn't give back what one expected them to give back. Now, let me add, I think that I'm seeing in the theater again, in the last few months, the old audience. I didn't think they were alive anymore. Now, to be sure, I'm talking about two specific shows. One was Pete Gurney's play, which I saw recently, called Perfect Party. It's playing in a tiny theater on 42nd Street. Mm-hmm. The other is playing in the Vivian Beaumont Theater, which is a very large theater. It's called the House of Blue Leaves. The important thing is that those audiences, suddenly, you could tell the difference like that. It was a different level of electricity in those two theaters. They were back. I looked around, I thought, geez, this is exciting again.
Well, I hadn't planned to go to this quite so early, but does that therefore stimulate you to say...
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
You're in the middle of writing your autobiography. Can you set that aside and...
Well, I've got two plays coming up in January with the Lincoln Center, the same people that put on the House of Blue Leaves. It's too early to really say at this point, but I have the feeling that it's almost a kind of music in the air. See, they're not tired. God knows there's as much egotism as there has to be in the theater. But it's subordinated to something else, which is the way we used to look at ourselves when we were starting out. We were doing All My Sons, you felt you had a mission. God knows what it was, aside from the fact you were going to get famous and rich and the rest of it. But that wasn't all that was involved, by any means. People didn't know what it was to go to sleep. And you don't do that for just money and fame and so on. We were pursuing beauty, some kind of perfection. I remember Carl Malden fainting, losing consciousness on the stage. One day, because Kazan kept pressing him to get more and more angry. And he went off and he came back angrier. And Kazan said, "He's not angry." And he finally came on. He was so angry, he went down in a heap. We didn't think that was remarkable. That's what an actor was supposed to do.
Yeah.
We did Salesman, Lee Cobb in Philadelphia, the day before, afternoon that we were, of the opening night. Kazan thought it would be a great idea for us to go across the street to the symphony and hear the Ninth Symphony. And Lee sat there, that big lard.
Lee Cobb.
And as it was going on, I would whisper in his ear, I said, "See, that's the end of Act Two. Right there." You know, we were fanatics.
Yes.
Then later on, I did stuff in the theater, and people were saying, "Well, it's pretty good."
Well, wait a minute. Maybe it wasn't as good. Maybe it was that the fanaticism, you'd received every award imaginable.
I tell you
you'd
what,
made a lot of money. You'd moved, in effect, out of the city. And conceivably, you weren't as hungry to do. And I don't mean just you, but Tennessee seemed to have that same problem. Right. Bill Inge seemed to have that same problem.
Excepting, you see, I don't know anybody who slipped in to take our places with the old attitude at that time. Mm-hmm. When I would meet, as I did, younger writers, they were cool. The thing had become quite technical. Playwriting was now a craft of... the moral electricity behind it all had evaporated, leaving the technology behind it, the technique. And
Why? You've certainly...
well, it may have a wider social causation than the theater itself. I don't know. I suppose we were still steamed up as a result of the crash, the 30s. You know, this form, this mindset was still in us.
But then there was the McCarthy time, and then there was the Civil Rights Revolution, and then there was Vietnam.
Well, you see, those things seemed not at the time to create... Maybe people simply got turned off or discouraged or fatalistic. See, we had no, at least I didn't, and the people I knew, Clurman didn't, Kazan in those days didn't, and a lot of the others, the actors certainly didn't, have a passive or negative feeling about it. They may not know what to do, but the idea was that you had to take a stance of resistance to the disintegration of experience.
Of course, some of this, undoubtedly was triggered by the advent of serious drama on television. Back in the so-called golden age of television.
Well,
The 50s.
my reaction, which is all I can vouch for, in those days was, I didn't feel that. It may have been that I had a prejudice toward the theater. But I remember thinking that a lot of it was perhaps more, well, it was melodramatic. It was, some of the acting was terrific, like in Marty.
Oh.
It was wonderful. And there were really first-class things, but not many. You know, we always overbuild these memories. It was always much fewer than anybody really wants to face. There wasn't all that much. Any more than there was all that much in the 30s or the 40s.
Let's stay with this television gambit for a moment, though. 1950s. Conceivably, the very audience that you're talking about that had deserted the theater, the serious theater, simply wanted to stay at home and watch serious drama, or sports, or the Milton Berle show, or the Ed Sullivan show, or whatever. That crowd could discover something new every night and didn't feel that they needed the theater. News as well.
Well, I hadn't, at the time, I suppose I wasn't a good judge of that for this reason. See, at the time, I was still under the spell of the uniqueness of the theater as an art form.
Oh, you're one of those snobs who said, like the professor who climbed up on the top of his house and decided to delouse his home by taking off the television antenna.
Yeah, well, I had nothing against it. It's just that I didn't see that it could be that deep, dig that deep into you. Of course, I felt that way about the movies. See, I used to say with great conviction that you could never be moved by a mechanical rendering of experience the way you could by a live actor. There's something in that, but not as much as I would have thought. Because I've seen some films that contradict that completely.
Arthur, middle 50s. See It Now, Ed Murrow. The Army.
The entertainment was
the Army
terrific.
McCarthy hearings.
Yeah, right.
I mean, you were seeing played out on your screen
Yeah,
the very things that you used to write about.
that's right.
All My Sons, for instance, was really in effect happening
Yeah.
in Washington, in hearing rooms and
Yeah, I
investigations.
guess you're right about that. Maybe they did get, and maybe it happened. See, I keep referring to Europe again because something of this thing happened there, where the conditions were quite different. But I don't think that the split in the audience occurred in Europe. It's simply that the whole audience dwindled a little bit. The Europeans used to tell me this. Now, In America, in New York, I think what we've been saying is the case, that there was certainly a breakage in the audience, in the sense that what happened was that the tourist in New York kept coming.
Mm-hmm.
A certain sector of the middle class kept coming, but a vital leadership section of the middle class was fewer. You know, an audience has a leader. As an actor, any actor knows. Some nights, the same thing creates a marvelous response. He does the same thing the next night, and it doesn't. My theory is that in any group of 500 or 1,000 people, there's a statistical average of a few leaders. See, they're the first ones to laugh. Everybody says, "Oh, that's funny."
Uh-huh.
He laughed. If they're not there, it may be only 6 or 8 people in that group.
Another question.
Nothing happens.
The actor, the actress. How responsible are they really for the success of the playwright?
95%, my humble opinion. In the first go-round, when a play opens, if the play is miscast, more or less severely, there is no power on earth that can penetrate. If it were Hamlet, it would, or pick a play that you loved. Salesman.
Death of a Salesman.
Well, my friend, if it had not been where that music was played full out, it could easily not have happened.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example, and it's not that the actors are bad actors. The first time A View from the Bridge was put on was with Van Heflin, a considerable actor and a wonderful man. He told me when he was cast, he said, "You know, I'm not sure this is for me." Why? He came from Oklahoma, the son of a dentist. He'd never heard the lingo on the Brooklyn waterfront.
Yeah.
Not really. I used to take him around the waterfront so he could listen to it. And then he tried to do it. What happened? He was so busy doing that, what he was hearing, the music was never coming out of it.
Yeah.
Now you take an actor like Tony LoBianco. He can't talk any different out of the way. He doesn't have to think about that.
Right.
He's dealing with the relationships and it becomes electric. Or that other guy who's a genius, Duvall. Now, Bob Duvall played it the first time. I was sure they had found some guy on the waterfront. I went backstage to see him, and there was a lieutenant commander of the Navy standing there with a white naval uniform. I thought, what is this man doing here? It was his father. Bob Duvall had been brought up as a Navy brat all over the world, had no connection with the waterfront, but he had something here that connected.
Lee Cobb, of course, in Death of a Salesman. It's almost hard to think about the play without Lee Cobb,
Right.
in spite of the fact that it's been done so many times in so many countries.
Yeah, but he puts the imprint on it. It's his play.
I-
It'll always be his play.
I recently saw, as a matter of fact, just yesterday, saw the Chinese version, or parts of the Chinese version, of Death of a Salesman. And it was fascinating to see they used the kini, or the film, of the English language.
Right.
And then superimposed those words over the Chinese actors doing it.
It was tremendous.
Weren't you weren't you concerned when Death of a Salesman was going to China just a few years ago that they wouldn't understand
Oh,
Death
yeah.
of a Salesman?
I was and I wasn't, though. I'll tell you why I wasn't. Well, I was because, like everybody else, I understand the Chinese up to a point, and then I'm in Never Never Land. They're opaque. Principally because I don't understand a word of the language. I had hope only for one reason. I had been to China, I'd written about China. You see, their obsession with the family is Jewish, practically. That's the original Jewish family. See, a Chinese mother is a Jewish mother in disguise. As one of the women who, when we were rehearsing, my wife speaks Chinese, and one of the women when we were rehearsing, was sitting there weeping and so on. She was a technician in the theater. She was a cold operator. She wasn't the average audience, and she was swept away. And Inga said to her, "Then it moves you." She said, "Willie Loman is exactly like my mother." And I found this reaction time and time again. See, the Oriental mother is supposed to vanish into the wallpaper. In fact, when the door closes, she's in charge of the whole
boss.
thing.
But it's traveled to Japan and to France and to Israel and to wherever.
Which is a heartening thing to me, only for the reason that the cultural differences are there. But way down deep below there, it's one humanity.
Yeah.
And that's a reassuring thing.
That also becomes an annuity for a playwright, no?
Oh, sure. But that's not as produced as some of my other plays.
What's produced more? All My Sons?
No, The Crucible.
The Crucible is.
Almost twice as often.
Why?
There are probably several reasons. One is that it's easier to do. See, to do Salesman, you need a big actor. It's a marathon of a part.
Mm-hmm.
Not all groups in the country, or any country, have that kind of an actor available. Secondly, there's a lot of women's parts in The Crucible, and as we know, most dramatic groups are mostly women. Thirdly, and maybe this is the most important thing of all, there is a message in that play, which a lot of people are worried about all the time. The message being the destruction of the freedom of a man to think what he wants to think. I have had some interesting experiences with that play in foreign countries, which is that when that play starts getting produced and is a big hit, especially in Latin America, it means one of two things. Either a dictatorship is about to take over, or one has just been overthrown. When they're really worried about the direction of the government vis-a-vis civil rights or human rights, they start doing that play. Now, in this country, where most of the productions are, it has become it's taught in all the schools, and they just like to do it.
It grew out of the Army McCarthy hearings, did it?
I tell you, I knew that story when I was at Michigan, and even there...
The Crucible.
Yeah, but I knew it as simply a marvelous, mysterious story. But when the McCarthy thing started, I was simply inarticulate when it came to explaining to people who were being carried away with this why it was a horror. I couldn't explain it. Once they said, "Well, what's wrong with what he's doing?" Well, you try to explain to somebody saying that, it gets more and more difficult. But I knew that at the bottom of it all, we were being eroded in our relations with one another. And finally, as usual happens with me, I started to think about this story. And in the writing of the story, I discovered what it was that was really bothering me. And it was that fundamentally what they were demanding was, you're all right as long as you give us your conscience. We're not going to bother you anymore. You let us decide what you think is right and wrong, and you're safe.
The loyalty oath.
All of that, sure. But it can happen between a man and a wife. It can happen between a woman and a woman, a man and a man. Human relations very often start to impinge one on the other's sense of what is good or bad, right and wrong.
Refresh my memory. As far as you were concerned, you were hauled up before the...
That was 3 years later.
4
years later.
4 years later?
That was 56.
1956.
In front of the committee, yeah.
Un-American Activities Committee.
Yeah, but the Crucible was 52.
Was before. Yes, I know.
Yeah.
What actually did happen to you in 56?
I decided that I had not done anything that required me to call upon the protections of the Fifth Amendment or the First Amendment or any amendment. So I went in there naked. And
they asked you?
And they said, and I had been to communist meetings in the past. I had told them that. They knew that. So at one point, as the end of the whole thing, which took about an hour or so, they said, who was in the room when you entered one of these meetings? I said, well, I'm not going to answer that question. I don't think. They're all writers anyway. Well, I'd bring trouble on some people who had enough trouble. And it's of no investigative importance. It has nothing to do with the security of the United States. And they mentioned a guy's name. And he said, was so-and-so in the room? This was purely a ploy, you see. Well, I figured, if they knew he was in the room, what are they asking me for? What can I add, accepting that obeisance that they wanted me to perform was really at issue?
Was there a lawyer by your side?
Yeah, but you were not allowed to confer with a lawyer. It was right out of Salem. Right out of Salem. Joe Rao was sitting next to me. We could not talk to one another.
So you had to make up your mind what you were going to say on the spot?
Right there.
He'd probably instructed you.
Well, I didn't know what they were going to throw at me. You don't know. See, they had a pile of, I must have signed 8,000 protests, petitions. I mean, it went back to the year one. I couldn't remember 98% of them. Some of them were when I was in college. So I said, I can't do that. I'm not going to. I'm asking you not to ask me that question. And they persisted. They said, well, you're in contempt if you don't answer. I said, well, then that's it. So I had to go through a court trial 6 or 8 months later, a federal court. I was convicted of contempt in the federal court. Then the whole thing was thrown out in the Court of Appeals with no comment. They didn't even say one thing. They just said it's no. I'll finish that story. That's 50, by that time, let's say 57, I think. 57, 30. Let's say 27 years passes. I get a letter one morning from a professor in either University of Iowa or University of Idaho or someplace like that. My uncle was the judge of the federal court who convicted you. And I have often wondered what you felt about him. He's dead now, and he was a very kind man. Judge McLaughlin, his name was. And he helped me a lot in my life. And this was a very civilized letter, a very nice letter. And he always said that the one thing in his life he regretted was that case. I could only tell him the truth. I said, look, I'm sure he was a nice man. And he certainly wasn't ugly to me in any way. But he had many opportunities to punch holes in the government's presentation.
And he didn't.
He just didn't. For example, 5 or 6 times, the prosecutor named Hitz would say, now when Mr. Miller went to Czechoslovakia, well, I'd never been in Czechoslovakia. So Joe Rao would have to get up and say, Your Honor, Mr. Miller's never been in Czechoslovakia.
Now we're in court. We're not in front of the committee.
He'd sit down. The judge would say, well, Mr. Hitz, what? So, well, when he went to Czechoslovakia, he was not authorized by the United States, by his passport. See, they had to hang the whole hearing on some legalistic thing, so they picked out passports. They pretended they were investigating passport, misuse of American passports. And I had been in Europe in 1950, and I'd been in Italy and France. I'd never gone to the East. But they were trying to make it seem as though I had been authorized to go to Italy and France, but I had really gone to Czechoslovakia. Well, Joe and I were sitting around after the 3rd day of this trial. Suddenly he leaped up in the air. He says, for God's sake, he said, Czechoslovakia in 1948 was an ally of the United States. I'd forgotten completely about it. You could have gone to Czechoslovakia. There was nothing wrong going to Czechoslovakia. Beneš was the president of Czechoslovakia then. It's before the communists had taken over the government. So he couldn't wait to get into court the next day. And sure enough, Hitz gets up and says, now, when Mr. Miller went into Czechoslovakia, he said, Your Honor, Czechoslovakia, at the time they're referring to, was an ally of the United States. If he had wanted to go to Czechoslovakia, which he didn't, he could have legally gone to Czechoslovakia on that passport. Pause. Well, I'll never forget Judge McLaughlin. He looked like Warren Gamaliel Harding, very white-haired, rosy-cheeked man. He says, well, I think it falls under the four corners of the indictment. I could feel a tent being built over my head, with four corners.
Yeah.
And Hitz went right on. I said to Joe, what does that mean? He said, nothing. See, that's it. Such were the times. So it wasted a lot of people's time, a lot of money.
It went all the way to the Supreme Court, did it?
No, Court of Appeals.
To the Court of Appeals.
And they threw it out. They threw out the whole case.
Who had to pick up the tab for your defense?
I will say I did. It really smacked me in the back of the head. But the law office, Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Garrison, etc., didn't charge me for a large part of it.
Really? You were married to Marilyn at this time?
Yeah.
She was by your side?
Well, a lot of the time, yeah. But you see, she couldn't easily come into Washington, D.C. to cause a riot in those days.
Yeah.
Wherever she went, it was a major crowd. So it was pretty tough.
During those years that you were married to Marilyn Monroe, did that marriage have anything to do with the fact that you were perhaps not as productive?
Oh, sure. Certainly. I wrote The Misfits in that period, which, even in the best of times, I acted as a kind of willy-nilly. I didn't want to, but as a producer, in effect, because, first of all, it was my script. Secondly, she looked to me to keep everything happy, as I would have had to do whether she looked to me or not. I was just interested in keeping it all together. So that took a year, at least, as every movie does. That's being conservative about it. But the other thing was that we were, the intensity of the problem of living in that environment of Hollywood and movies and the rest of it was simply distracting. I couldn't think. It was impossible. I'm usually a very unsocial fellow. I mean, I live up here. There's nobody up here but woodchucks and a few friends. And I see the woodchucks more often than the friends. And I need long periods of gestation to do anything.
Well, that's why your friends, I guess, people who knew you at all, thought that that whole episode with Marilyn Monroe was atypical of.
Oh, it was, yeah. It was, in a sense, yeah. And I was never really, and I don't think many people are, comfortable in that kind of situation. Certainly most writers wouldn't be.
Is that a very sore memory still?
Well, I feel that it did neither of us very much good, finally. And therefore I regretted that much of it. But you can't argue with life. But finally, there's no way to argue with it.
We are the sum of our parts. That obviously you wanted something or needed something or were
right.
Trapped yourself into something.
I wrote a play called The Price, which really refracts that experience in many ways, even though it's got nothing to do with my marriage directly.
Mm-hmm. After the fall, how much did that have to do with your marriage?
A lot, but not as much as... See, I started to write about that kind of a situation long, long before I really knew Marilyn very well, before I even knew her. It's funny. My life many times has reenacted what I'd already written. In other words, I started to write it first.
Mm-hmm.
And I have manuscript that goes back 10 years before that.
That is similar to After the Fall?
Yeah, very much. That's why Bob Whitehead tells it, laughs and says, and it's true, that at one point I said to him, when we were starting out, I said, do you think they're going to think that this is Marilyn? And he looked at me as though insane, see? But actually,
Well, I doubt it.
that came from a very early image.
But you can certainly forgive an audience for believing that it
Of
came
course,
from Marilyn because
yeah.
they didn't know that.
Of course.
And there were those who felt that you were trafficking
And
unnecessarily
also the makeup
Yeah.
and hairdo
of Barbara Loden.
of Barbara Loden, which simply... See, I could never put Barbara Loden together with Marilyn.
because
Well, there was simply no resemblance. Spiritually, physically, any other way, to me. And it's therefore when it was simply thought, well, it's just Marilyn, I thought, my God, they don't know what Marilyn is like.
Kazan directed After the Fall.
Right.
But you had a falling out with Kazan, no?
Well, it was right after his testimony from the Un-American Activities Committee.
He answered questions that you
That's right.
decided you were not going to answer. He named names.
That's right.
Was that a big
Oh, yeah, that was a
falling
big-
apart?
Well, it was simply that I could go along with it. And I felt that we needed to resist this committee for the reasons I've indicated. I felt that they were going to destroy, and indeed under the next incarnation was McCarthy. See, they antedated McCarthy. They came before McCarthy. That if that thing were allowed to continue and people cooperated with it, we would have thought control in this country. We would have to account to them, either literally or in the quiet of our rooms. We would figure, well, I better not do this because they're not going to like this. And I couldn't support that.
Was there a
When
specific falling out between the two of you?
no, we never fought about it. There was nothing to fight about. He went one way and I went the other.
And he was regarded for having done that with some contempt in some places.
Well, because of the obvious reasons, sure. But years had passed between whenever that was, 51, I think, or wherever. I can't remember now the exact year. And 60, which was almost a decade when I wrote After the Fall. And Bob Whitehead had, by this time, done what one had hoped would be done one day, and that is organized an art theater, we hoped, in New York. And Kazan was quite rightly selected by him to head up the artistic side of it, because there was nobody better, certainly, objectively speaking, than he, that I knew about. And Bob came to me and said, we want to play from you. Well, I'd spent about, by this time, 5 years lamenting the fact that the commercial Broadway theater was killing me and everybody around it. And here was a chance to really launch something new. And I kind of figured I couldn't argue with his selection of Kazan. I thought he was absolutely the right man to do this job. He had had more experience doing this than anybody. The group theater, it was like a continuation, or would be, of the group. And I agreed to do it. And we went back and went to work again. But it didn't work for numerous reasons. And the whole theater, that whole theater was blasted out of the water interestingly, by events that had nothing to do with After the Fall.
You deplore the fact, really, that there isn't that kind of an art theater, so to speak.
But I think we're going to get back to it. That's what I started to say earlier.
Isn't Joe Papp's undertaking more or
Yeah,
less the kind of thing you're
but-
talking about?
It is. Joe does a marvelous job down there. No question about it. The optimum thing in the city of New York would be there's 5 theaters like this. There should be. There's 10.5 million people in New York City. It's as large as a lot of countries. A. B. There's endless number of unemployed actors. There's a tremendous potential audience. We could be the new Greece. We could. We've got tremendous talent in this country, in all directions. It's being wasted.
And there isn't because?
$45 a ticket. I don't have to say anymore. Mm-hmm. What more do you have to say? Who can do that? I don't do it. I do everything I can do to get whoever I know in the theater to be honored by my presence.
Is it the theatrical unions that drive up those prices, or is that...
Hardly, yeah. I had a talk with Bob Whitehead the other day, last week, in fact. And just since I'm writing my autobiography, I wanted to be sure that from a businessman's point of view, and he's partly a businessman, partly an artist, that I wasn't really barking up a tree. I said, he's got a play on now called The Petition with the...
Hume Cronin and Jessica Tandy.
Jessica. 2 people. One set. I said, Bob, could you do that play at a profit for $20 a ticket? He said, sure. I said, well, why don't you do that? He said, I'd need a few concessions to do that. Like, I asked. He says, well, we've got a man on stage who pulls the curtain up and he pulls the curtain down. He gets $800 a week. We got another man who's a carpenter. He does nothing because there's no carpentry to do. We have a third man who turns a light switch. He literally pushes a light switch at the beginning and he pushes it down at the end. The lights, such as there are, because it's a one-set show in the living room, they come on slowly and they go down at the end. That's the lighting. The guy can go out for lunch. He's got to sit back there with that board and he just moves a little wand. And there's one other guy, I can't remember who. If they mop the floor, they pay $100 more. The bill, in short, is something like $3,600, $3,800 a week for these guys. He said, if I could get them to take $500 a week instead of $800 a week, he said, which I could do because there's a lot of unemployment in the unions. Sure. There'd be plenty of guys willing to do this, to do nothing for $500 a week. I could start to blow it. I said, what about the theater? He said, the theater would have to come down. It's rental. Everybody would have to come down. But I could easily do it. It wouldn't have to come down all that much, see. Now, why doesn't it happen? They get paralyzed. I'll give you a short, quick one. In '52, I was a member of the Dramatists Guild Council. And prices then were about $8. $6 for a lot of seats. They were going up to $8. And I got nervous. And I said, look, if this continues, we are out of business. On the scale of life at that time, that was already a lot of money. So you could buy a pair of shoes for $12. Mm. You were getting up to the price of a pair of shoes. That's a lot. I said, my friends can't go anymore. School teacher can't go anymore. See, a school teacher in those days made like $6,500 a year, etc. Let's call a meeting of all the parts of the theater, the producers, the scene designers, the rest of them, the actors' unions, the stagehands, and us, and see if we can get everybody to come down X amount so that we can go back to a $6 top. We did. I made my speech. Lee Schubert was there. There was somebody from the theatrical stagehands, etc., etc. I made this gallant, eloquent address. Took me 15 minutes. They all knew the story anyway. Schubert, who looked like a papyrus, he looked like a roll of tobacco, just sat there looking at me as though I had gone stark raving mad. He got up and walked out. He never even said hello. The thing simply dissipated. Nobody was interested because they all thought if you get a hit, you can get rich. And this guy's trying to tell us to produce plays as though we were poor and had to stay poor.
But of course, Miller, to a certain degree, then, I suppose some of them felt, has made his pile. He's made his reputation.
But what I was saying, I said, look, I make $6,000 a week when I've got a hit. In those days, that's what you did.
Right.
I said, I'm willing to make $3,000 a week. Half of it's going to the government anyway. I can live pretty well on $3,000 a week. I didn't start becoming a playwright in order to make $6,000 a week. I became a playwright to address the human race. And we are losing the human race. Well, of course, nobody gave a goddamn about it. The irresponsibility in the theater is practically total.
Irresponsibility.
They simply are getting what they can get. There's a lot of gouging going on.
Let me read a little bit, a couple of paragraphs from a piece in the Washington Post a couple of years ago by David Richards. They were three: Tennessee Williams, William Inge, and Arthur Miller, America's most lauded playwrights in the years following World War II, a theatrical triumvirate for the 50s. A decade ago, Inge committed suicide, alone and forgotten. Last year, Williams choked to death ignominiously on a bottle cap. His artistic powers, it was said, diminished by drugs, liquor, and riotous living. Only Miller remains at 68, unbowed and vigorous. It's 2 years later. What makes you a survivor?
I don't know. I suspect that it's partly the way I went into it. It may be, when you enter a profession or whatever it is with a certain fix, it stays with you.
Wait a second. Williams loved the theater. Inge loved the theater.
Well, of course.
Their lives, I suppose, to a certain degree, were they had tunnel vision about the theater.
Yeah, they did. Maybe that was the problem. See, I always saw the theater as being part of society. I never saw it as a separate place. It was always reflecting what was going on outside. My interests remained in politics, in society, and the rest of it. And of course, I have always had a family around me. And I think that more than any other single thing, accounts for the fact that I'm still here and talking. I have a terrific wife, wonderful family. My kids are marvelous. I live in a lovely place. And that gives you life. And you also, I think, as a result of that, can place your defeats in proportion. A playwright opens a paper when his play opens. The headline can be world ending. Well, he's not going to read the first page. He's going to go to the notices.
Yeah.
See?
And you've had your share of bad ones.
Oh, mostly bad ones. Most of the notices I've had in my life are bad. And I finally got, thank God, to where, first of all, I could be the father of most of the critics. But even long ago, I figured, well, if it's good, you see, it'll be there in 20 years. If it's not good, then it shouldn't be there in 20 years. And I've been righter than I've been wrong over the long haul. See, the View from the Bridge was fundamentally dismissed. So was The Crucible, really.
Yeah.
I don't think a year goes by that The View from the Bridge and The Crucible don't have major productions in Europe, here, Latin America, all over the world. The Crucible is just done by the Royal Shakespeare Company for about the 4th time in London. A View from the Bridge is now opening in a national theater, I guess the 3rd time. The Crucible has been done in London by Olivier, by some of the best actors in that country, here as well.
Okay. Critics. Is it a misperception, a lack of perception, the search for something, quote, new?
I have blamed them as much or more than anybody else, but I do believe that they represent a condition in the theater. For example, let's suppose you had the same group of critics, but the price of the ticket was $12. Furthermore, let us suppose that the New York Times broke down and sent in 2 critics instead of 1. I've suggested that to them.
Because?
I'll tell you. Okay. So that you get a consensus feeling. You get, instead of a monopoly, after all, There is no more monopolized culture in the entire world, including Russia.
Than the critic of the New York Times, in
Kidding,
effect.
you know. See, in Russia, since Stalin died, no one man can close down a play. Even Gorbachev can't close a play down. Yeah. A committee will close it down, but not a man.
But the New York Times can.
One man closes the play down. You can't do it in England. You can't do it in France. You can't do it anywhere else. Only here. That's not good. That's a monopoly. Now, whether he were the greatest critic that ever lived, might even be worse, because his power would be even greater. You need a consensus of some kind. Now, we don't have it, but that's only half of it.
Well, what you're saying is that two people from the Times could sit, in effect, in the same theater, same time, and come out with two reviews the following day?
Yes, or three. I'll tell you what happened. When the Tribune folded, whatever year that was, 60-something,
Right.
a very good critic, Walter Kerr, had been
At the Trib.
the Tribune. Okay, that was gone now. Suddenly, the New York Times found itself in a monopoly position in theater criticism. So, Clifton Daniel called a meeting. I was one of those at the meeting. I was on the panel with 2-3 other people and him.
He was then the managing editor of the Times.
Managing editor of the Times. Well, about 150 people came, actors, everybody, producers. I can't remember now. It was in a restaurant, I think, on 45th Street or something. What to do about this, because it was so new, the phenomenon, that the Times was shocked. They suddenly woke up one day and said, my God, there's only one critic. We don't want this kind of responsibility. What should we do? Well, it was kicked around. I said, look, let's confront the issue. We can't start another newspaper. You agree that you don't want this power. Therefore, put on one more or two more critics with different temperaments. Maybe Harold Clurman, who was totally different from the other guy, or Walter Kerr. He said, well, Walter Kerr's on Sunday. I said, yeah, but Sunday it's all over. It's too late. It must be that night. I would even see, if I were the editor and you want to sell newspapers, it'd be interesting to take one or two informed citizens and give them a 3-line paragraph, what they thought. So a person picking up the paper figured, gee, this is interesting. There's all kinds of contention about this play. It would keep the interest in the theater going, and you would temper the monopoly of power. He said, we can't do that. I said, why not? It may make good reading, but who would represent the opinion of the New York Times? Said he. So I said, in other words, you do want that power. You just got finished telling us you didn't want it. Now what I'm hearing is that you do. And indeed, at the bottom of the heart, they want to be right. That is to say, they want their critic to have what they call the shots. So the critic says a stinker is a stinker, a masterpiece is a masterpiece. That's power. The newspaper shouldn't care whether that happens. He should be wrong when he feels wrong. But it's too late now. They've got that, and that combined with the price of the ticket is lethal. Simply lethal. People are not going to spend $45 if whoever is writing the review for the New York Times says this is not worth 10 cents.
What's your best work, in your own estimation? What's the finest thing you've ever done?
I often think The Crucible is, quite frankly.
You do?
Yeah.
Because the general feeling is the death of a salesman
Yes,
will be
well,
the play for which Arthur Miller is going to be remembered into all time.
Depends where you are. The Royal Shakespeare Theatre just did a production of The Crucible, which I did not see. I wasn't there. And they took that play to Poland in English.
To Poland?
Poland. This was a year ago now.
Really?
And Nick Ham, who is the director of it, wrote me a long report saying that officials of the Polish government came. Now, by the way, I should add, that was played all over England in churches, in marketplaces, market squares, out in the open. Likewise in Poland, in English. And members of the government came, and people, Poles, have sent me letters saying, was the greatest thing in their lives to see that play.
It seems unusual for the Poles to permit it.
Well, they didn't, but they didn't forbid it either. In other words, it's a British Royal Shakespeare Theatre. They can do what they wish to do. They spent 2 weeks, they played in Wrocław and in Warsaw. And, you know, that makes me feel great. And I'm not sure, but that, who knows, in time to come, if I'm known for anything, it could be that. I wouldn't mind. I saw Olivier do it in the 60s, and all I can tell you is that I was real proud of that.
Are you writing a play now?
I'm in the last scene of a big one.
Really?
Yeah. But I have 2 new ones, which I'm very excited about.
Candidly, is there the appetite among producers for an Arthur Miller play that there used to be?
It depends what it is. You see, Broadway producers, forget it. They don't want. What they want is an English play that they will have seen. If you do, anybody puts a play on in some regional theater, they go to see it, and they think that it's proven, they'll bring it into Broadway. You know, they have with the costs what they are and the risks of failure, they're not about to originate anything. In the old days, we all used to excuse what was wrong with Broadway by saying, yes, okay, but they originate the American theater. Even that excuse is gone. I don't originate anything. Some musical, but nothing.
So you're saying about possible...
About my own work? Oh, I wouldn't have any problem getting a production, but it doesn't prove anything. I mean, there's always somebody going to want to do it.
And you're working on a couple of one-act plays, too, did you?
They're done. They're all finished.
And?
They're going to be done by the Lincoln Center Theater in January.
January 12th, I think they open. And those I'm excited about. They could be terrific. That'll be one evening of 2 plays.
You work all the time.
Never stop. But I throw a lot away. I have always thrown a lot away. If I can't really believe it, then it goes out. Or it lays there. I have more unfinished work than most people start.
You have received all manner of awards. Do they mean...
Very little.
Very little? Truly?
I'll tell you why. It's the reward or the award that means anything to me is the audience. If I can enter the hearts of people or their brains, that's it. And I go to see plays that have won awards of one kind or another, and it seems to me they're skating along a surface, if that's the case. What does the award mean? It's meaningless. Have you ever looked back on the Pulitzer Prizes of the past 35 years?
What did the Pulitzer Prize mean to you when you got it, which is 30, 35...
I tell you, when I got it,
40.
that was for Death of a Salesman. By that time, it was an anticlimax. Quite honestly.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I'll tell you a quick story. They gave me the award. They announced the award.
The Pulitzer.
In the paper. But I never received anything. Eisenhower was then president of Columbia University. Somebody must have realized that they'd forgotten. So they sent me a telegram a month later, signed Dwight Eisenhower, president of Columbia. And I ran into somebody, let's say 5 years later, I think it was a newspaper, maybe Murray Schumacher at the Times, I think it was. And he said, what did you ever do with the $500 you got for a Pulitzer Prize? I said, what $500? He says, well, they give $500 prize. So, I can't remember how I did this, but through somebody, I just thought, and he said, and where do you, he was here, where do you keep the citation? I never got a citation. It took about 25 years.
For you to get?
The $500 and the citation. So,
especially for an Arthur Miller who is known to be frugal.
Yeah, I missed that 500, I tell you. But it came in after the inflation had reduced its value by at least half. I now avoid awards if I can avoid them, quite frankly. I've gotten doctorates from every place in the world, and I've been turning them down. It just seems to me to be a case of people honoring themselves by bringing you into it, and I get very unhappy when I'm there. I don't know of an award I really want.
Do you have heroes or heroines?
Yeah, but I don't know of any alive now.
None.
Well, I probably shouldn't say none.
No one springs to mind.
No. The writers that I still respect and love are gone, of course. And then a lot of them are people like Chekhov, who exemplified something that was terribly crucial in civilization, I think. That kind of veracity to himself, that's hard. When you're talented, it's very easy to betray yourself.
And apparently
he
you...
never did. He didn't.
Has Arthur Miller never betrayed himself?
I hope not. I think that it's not that I was virtuous, it's that I find it hard to really finish something to my satisfaction. Or I'm so afraid that I'm doing something bad that I give it up before there's time to do that.
But since the days when you used to turn out pop radio scripts...
Well, that was good exercise.
Understood. You've not ever written and sold something in which you did not believe.
Not really, no. In fact, I quit a couple of times. It's no great... I had great confidence in my ability, I think, compared to a lot of other people. Earlier than most people get it. For example, so that I always felt that I could afford not to do that, even though I didn't have the money, and I had no right to say that. But for example, I had a job, which I did basically for money, writing a screenplay for Lester Cowan about Ernie Pyle's Here Is Your War, which was called The Story of G.I. Joe, finally, with Bob Mitchum. And I worked on that script for months and generated a whole script, which Lester wanted to bring in a collaborator. I had never written a screenplay, and probably he was sensible to try to do that. And I quit. I needed that money. But I was not able to do that. Mm-hmm. And the only reason I wasn't able to do it was I felt the resource, I think, that I could fall back on. Look, if I was going to write junk, I could write radio or something like that, which never had any pretension to being anything. But that screenplay would have had the pretension.
Dustin Hoffman? I saw the New York revival of Death of a Salesman, and I was astonished. Ahead of time to think of Dustin Hoffman in that role. And he was just wonderful.
Well, Dustin's a genius, of course. He's a great, great actor.
I know, but still.
But it was a transformation. Yes, but he's a transformer. He could turn himself inside out. He could play Admiral Peary of the North Pole.
Weren't you skeptical? He came to you and told you that he wanted to do it?
I tell you, the first time this was suggested to me, I laughed.
Yeah.
But it was way back when Ulu Grossbart was doing a production of View from the Bridge Downtown with Bob Duvall. And they had there a stage manager, an assistant stage manager. And Ulu said, there's a great actor in this room. And of course, Bob Duvall was a great actor in my opinion. I said, well, he is wonderful. He says, no, I don't mean Bob. Bob's terrific. I said, who? He says, right over there. I saw this child. He said, he should play Willie Loman. Now, Dustin then was before The Graduate. Dustin looked like a high school kid.
Yeah.
I said, Ulu, what are you talking about? He said, that's Willie. Years pass. And Dustin moves up here. He bought a house nearby here. He came over one day, and sort of sheepishly said, "You want to talk about it?" I said, "About what?" "About Willie." I said, "Yeah, I'll talk about anything." And I had grave questions about it. As mine weren't as grave as his were. But you see, he puts it together with one detail on another. His perception of the part was profound. And he turned himself into this creature. It's acting. It's just what acting ought to be, but most actors don't have the nerve or don't get the chance to do that.
Did his perception of Willie Loman differ in kind or degree with yours?
Not the perception, but you see, his equipment is different than Lee's. He can't come on as this grand, tragic figure because Dustin is not. He's got to build it up from ground zero.
He sure did, because going to see the show and seeing him come on at the beginning of the show, I was absolutely persuaded he could never bring it off, that it was a stunt and forget it.
Right.
And by God...
I know, because he knows what the central things are in the part. And he went for those jugular positions, and he made it. It's a great feat.
You may not want to tell me, if indeed this is so, has there been any play that you've done and has gone to Broadway and was miscast, and you believe that was the reason that the play didn't?
View from the Bridge, yeah. I think we miscast it. I'm as much to blame as anybody. As I started to say, Van was wrong.
Van Heflin.
He simply didn't. It's as though I were going to play a part that John Wayne should be playing. That simply won't work. And he knew that very early on, and it was discouraging. And I think that fundamentally it made it impossible.
In the Chinese version, I don't know why, but it just seemed such a natural transition from the American version, if you will, on film, to the stage there.
You know, when I went to China the first time, I said to Inga one day, I feel closer to these people than many European peoples, whose languages I know something about.
Because?
And I finally decided it was a Chinese sense of humor. You see, they are, like us, Americans kid a lot. You use irony a lot. It doesn't go over in Germany. They get offended. It goes over very badly in France. They get offended. Italians take it a little better, but just barely. The British sense of humor is ironical, sometimes cruel. But the Chinese sense of humor is just like ours. Same idea. Say, big shot. See, when he says big shot, they know exactly what that means. You don't have to explain it. And I found that was the entry. It was the humor in Death of a Salesman that made them believe that it was their show. That was their story.
It is, in a sense, the ultimately capitalist show, or maybe the ultimately anti-capitalist show.
Well, you take your choice.
Yeah.
Curiously, 2 weeks ago, as we sit here, the Parents Association of Corning, New York High School voted to ban Death of a Salesman from the school.
Because?
It was anti-American. Now, this occurs 2 years after it plays in the largest communist country in the world. And to them it means that a small man can still dream of great achievements. See, that's what they got out of it.
Mm-hmm.
He failed, but the dream was real.
And the people close by thought of it as the system grinding down this...
Right. Yes. But the capitalist, anti-capitalist part of it has ceased to matter quite as much over the years. It's funny. I think that what does matter in it is the question of whether or not he is too adapted to his society, too adapted to the reigning ideas of the society, and whether he should have held more in reserve. He should have been more skeptical.
The Chinese, of course, are about as capitalist in their souls as you can get. The overseas Chinese point this out all the time, and now under Deng Xiaoping, they're being given an opportunity. There's a phrase okayed by Deng Xiaoping which says, "To get rich is glorious."
Yeah. Well, when we were there was a lot of unemployment among the young men. And Deng Xiaoping and the Central Committee issued a statement saying, start a business. Find out what people need and see if you can travel around and supply it. That sounds like the United States about 1910.
Yeah. Can you see this Death of a Salesman playing in the days of Mao Zedong?
No, possible.
You started writing plays in your early 20s, and you wrote out of your own experience, your family's experience, your gut, your passion. You're 22 years old in 1986, a young playwright. Does he have the same opportunity today in the United States to write his plays and have them produced as you did?
In one way, it's easier. This sounds crazy, but it's easier. You see, when I started out, there was one theater. That was the Broadway Theater. You made it on Broadway, or you didn't make it. There was no regional theater. If you remember at Michigan, what we did there was the latest Broadway hit. Mm-hmm. It was inconceivable that they would do a student play. They did my play because I had won 2 awards with it, and we had to do it at the Hillel Foundation.
Wait a minute. They did one of Normie Roston's plays. I think it was Norm Roston, This Proud Pilgrimage.
Right. And that was known as a really remarkable fact that they'd done an unknown play. Oh. Now, when you came to New York, there was Eva Le Gallienne, who did classics, a couple of left-wing places, maybe. I didn't even know them, but I used to hear about that there was some group off on the Lower East Side, maybe 1 or 2. Mm-hmm. Well, now, the theaters are all over the place. There is a better chance for a young guy to get started that way. However, I would add this caveat. See, we thought we were writing for the majority of the American people. Now, this was an illusion always because the majority weren't in the theater. Statistically, workers weren't in the theater, blacks weren't in the theater, in the audience. But I'm sure Tennessee would corroborate this, and probably Inge and the rest of them. One never thought that one was writing for some small clique of educated, hip people. You had to fashion the play so that a man of some common sense or a woman of some common sense could be reached by that play. I personally think this grew out of the illusions of the time. That is to say, there was only that one theater. Another theater was inconceivable. Now, when that is what the playwright thinks he's doing, he fashions his play accordingly. His images are such that they are available to most people. You don't need to have read maybe Flaubert, maybe Aristophanes, maybe some philosopher to dig that image. You need only to be able to get up in the morning and go to work. See? This made a demotic theater. And those plays, therefore, evolved full-blown characters and stories. Starting someplace, I said this earlier, in the middle 50s, possibly with Beckett, the absurd theater with the UNESCO, irony by itself became, and black comedy in other cases, became the style. This couldn't be dug by a large number of people. They either rejected it because they weren't hip enough, or because it just went by them. That separated out the sheep from the goats. That helped to separate. The plays then became, in one respect, they may become more profound as social comment, became narrower in terms of story characterization and the traditions of storytelling in the theater. Until finally, that whole vein finally dribbled into the sand and became very repetitious. And now, my own belief is, we're back in the mainstream again. I sense that there is once again a desire for full-blown stories, development.
Social themes?
And social themes, yes. See, a play, as I mentioned to you before, which was written in the 60s, but nevertheless is now a big hit, is The House of Blue Leaves. The House of Blue Leaves is a social essay. It is a critique of the culture.
Well, of course, you took your lumps from some critics in the 60s, if you will. In a piece also in the New York Times, a number of serious critics have been unflaggingly harsh. Reviewing After the Fall, Richard Gilman insisted that ever since Death of a Salesman, Mr. Miller has been trying to live up to his reputation as a playwright of passion and ideas. Robert Brustein weighs in with a dismissive appraisal whenever a play of Arthur Miller's opens. In his view, Mr. Miller's social, psychological melodramas about family responsibility are old-fashioned, unserious, nothing in common with the high-minded theater of the avant-garde that he considers the proper air of modernism.
Yeah, well, that's what happened. And they led the audience for that period. Yeah. They also helped destroy the Lincoln Center to the point where they even said that the theater, the building, the Beaumont Theater, was an anti-theatrical theater and was worthless. And this was the conventional idea to the point where it was closed down for nearly a decade. The conventional idea being that this was some kind of a white elephant, an unusable theater. The theater happened to have been built on the plans of 3 German theaters, in Bochum, in Frankfurt, and in Dusseldorf. Now, a few years ago, Peter Brook came in with a production of Carmen. He knew nothing about this controversy. He walked into the Beaumont for whatever reason. I suppose it was made available to him. He did this production, which was hailed as a great production. And one of these reviewers said, well, what do you think of the theater? He said, the theater, I think, is one of the best theaters I've ever been in my life. So that closed that mouth. Now, at the present time, the Vivian Beaumont Theater is sold out every night under the direction of a young man, Greg Mosher, out of Chicago, who thinks it's a marvelous theater. And anybody who sits there, I think, would think so.
And mostly what kind of play?
Well, so far they've only done that. His group has only done the Blue Leaves.
House of Blue Leaves?
Yeah. Well, there have been other plays in there, of course. The Crucible played in there some years ago. There have been other plays in there. I thought it was a wonderful theater. But that group of critics, incidentally, was my point in mentioning.
When you say that group, you're talking Gilman, Brustein, Philip Roth, etc.?
Right. Yeah. These are intellectual critics who, in my humble opinion, led a movement whose gods were always abroad. I know of no American writer that they had any use for. Very few American actors, for that matter. The British were always the ones. One would never have known from them that we had any theater at all in this country that was worth anything. I was myself shocked when I went to Europe the first time, put on, in '57, put on A View from the Bridge under the direction of Peter Brook in London, to find that the British, in fact, we had a mass meeting in the Royal Court Theatre, at which I was one of the people who spoke. And they said, why is it that the American theater has all this vitality and the British theater has nothing? Well, I never heard that from one of our critics. Never. The truth of the matter is that this is an untold story. I hope to tell it in my memoirs. But we have led much of the playwriting of the post-war period. And one would never know it from reading our critics.
Well, you say that this is an untold story. The piece in the Times goes on their disdain. We're talking now, Brustein, Gilman, Rav. Their disdain is understandable given their conviction that high seriousness is only appropriate to modernist themes, alienation, angst, anomie, and their tendency to equate mass popularity with Philistinism.
Right. If it's popular, it can't be good.
They have contempt for the simplicity of Mr. Miller's ideas, and his ideas are simple. From the start, he's been drawn to certain primal situations: guilt and betrayal in the family, responsibility for the consequences of one's actions, the dread of failure in a society that has no place for it.
That's simple.
It's pretty. Those are, you're darn right, they're simple, and they make the best damn stories.
Well, it's also stuff you die of. It's a lost cause with arguing with these people because, first of all, they are people who want power but don't admit it. They would all like to be the critic of the New York Times. Secondly, it is as old as the American theater, by the way. It goes back to the beginning in the 18th century, that the foreign theater is regarded as artistic, while the native theater is regarded as barbarous. Critics as early as 1824, what's his name? The Hudson River writer, well, it'll come to me, was complaining that we had no American drama and that all our plays involved this simple Yankee of high moral character, outwitting the far more subtle but decadent Britain. That all these plays were variations of this story. Now, couldn't we start writing about something a little different, say? When we started writing about something a little different, they always said, well, it's better done by the English. It's a remarkable thing. The provincialism of the American critic vis-a-vis England is a very old story. Now, when I went to England in 1957, for a moment, because of my work, Tennessee's, Inge, a few other people, and I must say Bob Sherwood and a whole group of playwrights who immediately had preceded us, as well as Odette's a decade earlier. In comparison, they had some high comic writers of high, very narrow, esoteric works, but they had no reflection of England on the stage until Look Back in Anger, which has happened to be when I came there. And Olivier told me when I arrived, and he said, what do you want to see? And I said, I don't know one of your plays. And he showed me there's about 60 plays on. And I looked down, none of the titles meant anything to me. He says, no, you pick it out. I said, how am I going to pick it out? I don't know one from the other. I don't know any of these authors except Terence Rattigan. He said, well, find something. And I saw one title. It said, Look Back in Anger. I said, now that's a great title. He said, no, you don't want to see that.
Olivier said.
I said, why don't I? He says, it's a travesty on England. It's disgusting. I said, that sounds good. That sounds like what I want to see. And he said, all right, I'll get you a ticket. The next night I went to the theater, and there was Olivier. He said, I'll see it again with you. And we sat together, and after the first act, he said, what do you think? I said, it's goddamn good. It's the first play in England that I've seen that tells me something about England. The second act, likewise. The third act, George Devine, who ran the theater, is now dead, came down. They had done all my plays in the Royal Court. And he said, the author's upstairs. He'd love to see you. could you come up for a minute and have a drink? I went upstairs with Olivier, and there was Osborne. And we had a drink, and Olivier was sitting opposite Osborne, I was sitting opposite Devine, and we were talking, and they were talking, and suddenly I hear Olivier saying, Osborne, do you suppose you could write something for me? Which turned out to be The Entertainer. But this is an ancient story. You gotta grin and bear it.
It's the only time I've seen you, your skin pricked in this 2.5 hours. You really are, you believe that they do a disservice.
Oh, yes, they've destroyed a lot. You see, to misinform the young is a serious business. And it takes a while for people to get their heads up again and get straightened out. They are now. I don't think they listen to these guys anymore. My impression is, among the young, as the ones I've talked to, they're just people again, and the heavy intellectual layer that they were under seems to have been digested. They're not overimpressed anymore.
Question. Did you ever think that you would live to see the day that an actor would be president of the United States?
Well, you know, this is a recent thought of mine, although it's an ancient one, really. You know, politicians are actors.
Oh, of course.
Just as ministers are. Anybody who stands in front of the public is an actor.
He is a better actor as politician, the president is, than he was as actor.
Yeah. And when this last campaign was going on, and with, what's his name, Reagan's opponent, whose name I can't even remember now, I said to myself, watching them one night, I thought, we're now casting for the role of president. You know, very often in my life, I've sat in a theater, look at guys and say, well, could he be Willie Loman? Could he be Eddie Carbone? Could he be whatever? Mm. Well, which of these guys could be, quote, unquote, the president? Well, of course, Mondale looked like a sort of a funeral director from Minnesota. The guy who you cast to play, if you had only two of them, and you had only two of them, you'd cast Reagan. And my only argument is that his range of thought is not wide enough, but I don't know whose is at the moment.